Okay, let's talk about the thing. At Lee and Wenwu's first meeting, he says, "You don't know who you're talking to," and she replies, "I don't care who you are." Which is neat, because soon, of course, they're going to fall in love and care about each other enough to get married and have babies and play Dance Dance Revolution. But it's also neat, because Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is all about who Wenwu is, and who Lee is, and who Shang-Chi is because of them. So while we're going to talk about Lee and Wenwu's beautiful floaty forest fight, it's only one half of a pair of bookends, so you're getting 2 fights for the price of 1. I'm Jill Bearup, I fight people on stage, flirty fights are kind of my jam, and the late Brad Allen's choreography here is just lovely. And it combines with the effects and the music and the cinematography so well, and such gorgeousness in a Marvel movie. We love to see it. The forest fight is also a fight that improves for me every time I see it. I mean, the first time I saw it, I thought it was beautiful, but thematically kind of weird, because obviously you don't know that something is going to be a bookend when you haven't seen the whole movie. Now that I've seen the movie a couple more times, I just love it even more. So the plot goeth thusly. After falling out of a moving vehicle in a magic forest, while looking for a magic village called Ta Lo, 1000-year-old warlord Wenwu stumbles across a forest clearing. The clearing contains a waterfall, a lot of bamboo, and a woman who really takes matching her accessories seriously. This is Yingli. Wenwu demands entry to the village, full of arrogance. She calmly tells him to jog on. He powers up the 10 rings and she's just not even worried, man. Remember that stance he takes though, because it will be back later. They fight and she comprehensively kicks his butt. But it's clearly a very emotionally intense experience for both of them, because later he comes back. Where did he find an iron? In the forest? Did he go home? And how did he come back if he did? Anyway, they fall in love and she leaves Ta Lo and they have babies, and then she gets murdered by his former enemies and he goes back to warlording. His kids, after a few years, run away and do their own thing. He becomes convinced that his wife is actually locked behind this magical gate in Ta Lo, but actually it's some kind of eldritch horror. He takes the kids' pendant so he can find Ta Lo again, and then of course Shang-Chi has to fight his dad and prevent him from opening the gate. Spoiler, he fails and they have to fight the eldritch horror anyway. The fight between Shang-Chi and Wenwu comes in a couple of parts, and to cover the first part briefly, where they're in the village, it's a really good example of the if you're the one talking, then you're the one controlling the action trope.
I'm not afraid of you.
Yes, you are.
So the first few phrases are Wenwu talking and you're acting, sir, it's just amazing. And Shang-Chi gets knocked down and hit a lot. All the bitterness about his wife's death comes out and Wenwu straight up blames his son for not standing up with his mother against the hundreds of trained killers who had come to kill somebody. But it's also obvious that that's the grief talking and that he wants to believe it but he doesn't really. And then the tables turn and his son speaks and Shang-Chi starts landing some hits of his own until he gets a little bit near the knuckle and delivers the killer line.
What makes you think she'd want anything to do with you?
Oof. And retaliation ensues. Kersplash. Anyway, big CGI slugfest ensues and then Shang-Chi and Wenwu face off again in something that is not exactly a one-to-one of the forest fight, but it's resonant, shall we say, and I love it. So let us return to the forest, not very far away geographically, but a couple of decades in the past. Wenwu powers up the 10 rings, Lee doesn't give a stuff, and we go straight in with some punching at her with the rings from a distance while she floats and twirls and floats and twirls and then throws her hat at him. Which both gives him a look at her face and is amusing to me for reasons that I can't quite articulate. Possibly something to do with the fact that he's shooting at her with killer magic rings and she responds by throwing her hat at him. Like, I love it. She then does some sweepy Tai Chi, which stirs up the air and the leaves and I guess the energy around her. First thing Shang-Chi does? Oh yeah, copies her. With a bit of his dad in there too. All of his movements are more forceful than hers, but generally less brute force than the dad's. First thing his dad does? Yeah, that does look familiar, doesn't it? The second thing his dad does is, yes, I'm going to punch at you with my rings from afar, and when that doesn't work, I'm going to get in close. And yet, oh dear, somehow most of my hits aren't landing. They're being blocked or deflected. Now, there is a contrast here between the forest fight and the father-son fight. Shang-Chi has only just started to realize the potential of the gifts his mother has given him, and also we need to emphasize that this is the final showdown, etc. Wait, that's something else. Anyway, he gets hit. Lee gets caught by the rings and pulled in close, but she blocks or deflects every single strike and she never gets hurt. Shang-Chi is holding his own in the fight, but he does struggle. You can see the effort on his face. Lee just isn't even bothered. You look at her and you can see that she's probably thinking something like, what an interesting addition to my day this turned out to be. And that's another thing I love about the forest fight, aside from this obvious contrast in styles and how smooth and beautiful it is. It's that obvious power that she has. Wenwu is terrible. terrifying. We've seen him lay waste to men and armies and cities like it's a walk in the park, and she is blocking his superpowered jumping ring-assisted strikes like they're doing a demonstration for 5-year-olds. And I really love the quality of this air or energy or whatever it is effect that happens when she blocks the strikes to subtly reinforce that, yeah, there is something very magical going on here. I mean, obviously the jumping into the air, twirling around and sliding over the ground is also giving that away, but I just really like this effect. Of course, the other reason that Lee doesn't get hurt at any point in the course of this fight is that that's kind of a Flirty Fight staple. You can't have people wailing on each other too hard and actually hurting each other. It just doesn't really fit with the emotional theme. It would not look amazing to have two characters who are meant to get together at the end kick the ever-loving snot out of each other. And if you're going to do that, brutality in a fight between two people who clearly care very much about each other tends to emphasize how broken they are and how bad they are at communicating. Does anyone else remember the boxing match between Starbuck and Apollo in the Battlestar Galactica reboot? Because I'm thinking of that right now. But anyway, back to the similarities between the bookend fights, which continue with some spinning around. Goodness, he really does look like his mum, doesn't he? Then fighting with the rings as a scary magic chain weapon, and then, oh dear, you should know better, Wenwu sends the rings at his son, because that went so well the last time you did it. At least he's smart enough this time to only send half of them. If you want the rings, you have to prove you're strong enough to carry them, and all that. The rings go gold, we go full-on anime fight, and remember Ying Li teaching Shang Chi, and then where the forest fight ends with Ying Li saving Wenwu from a broken neck and just dunking him in a pond instead, we carry on. And I'm so glad, because it means we get this section of rings versus rings, which is just visually stunning to emphasize that Shang Chi is taking on the attributes of both of his parents and making them his own. Lee avoids the rings, almost exclusively, and only performs one attack with them, that being her signature finishing move. But in this phrase, Shang-Chi at least partially embraces the rings and does some really neat creative stuff with them, like using the rings to climb into the air, and also using them to assist with kicks. And of course there's this great blue-orange contrast which helps us know what's going on visually. Note please that Shang-Chi doesn't actually wear the rings in this phrase, because we need to work up to the visual acceptance that he is made from both his parents. But they do fight rings versus rings, and just look at it, I love it. And then in the forest fight, Ying Li sends the rings back with such force that she could have killed Wenwu. I mean, a fall from a very high tree onto your head is liable to do that. But she chooses mercy. In the father-son fight, as in the final phrase of the forest fight, all of Wenwu's power has been subverted and he looks a bit worried. Possibly because he remembers what happened the last time. Last time, someone who had no reason to show him mercy did so. This time, his son, who he has trained not to have mercy and to be a killer, shows him mercy anyway, because he's a better person. He could take your rings from you at any time, Wenwu. He just chooses not to. And then the emotional climax happens, because now they actually have to talk to each other instead of punch at each other with magic rings. We get a moment of understanding, and then the scary tentacle monster breaks out, and Wenwu uses the rings to save his son's life, and then dies, but not before giving the rings to Shang-Chi. And I said this in the vlog that I made about this episode, but I feel like the Marvel formula kind of lets us down here, because now we have to go on to resolve the arcs of absolutely everybody else during this big CGI slugfest part 2. And I'm kind of about that, but it does give us this beautiful moment of Shang-Chi and his perfect clarity about who he is. Because to defeat the monster, he wears the rings, and he uses the rings in the style of both of his parents. Ah, look at that perfect combination of punchy punchy and floaty floaty. Fine, look at that perfect combination of Hungar Kung Fu and Tai Chi, ain't it thematically resonant? I love it. Did I mention I love it? I really love it. For more flirty fights, there is a playlist to the side of my face, starting with my favourite flirty fight of all time, The Mask of Zorro, and there is also the option of whatever video that YouTube thinks that you will like best. Enjoy!